Good afternoon, everyone. And for those of you who were previously with us for the Tuesday Scholar Talk that just concluded about a half an hour ago, nice to see you again. We're all back for the bonus program for today. I am Judy Woodward, the History Coordinator of the Ramsey County Library, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to this event today, this special event, with Alan Page and Neel Kashkari, who will be speaking on the topic Educational Equity and the Page Amendment. Today's speakers are two of the best known voices of Minnesota. As probably every single person in this audience knows, Alan Page is a retired justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court and a legendary pro football player. Neel Kashkari is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Today's program is brought to you with the technical support of the Federal Reserve. I'm very grateful for their participation. Thank you very much, Paul Wallace, and your colleagues for helping on that. Before I turn the virtual podium over to our speakers, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the tech aspects of the Zoom webinar we're going to do today. We are going to have both the chat box and the Q&A line open today, but we're going to use them for different purposes. We ask you to keep your questions to the Q&A column. If you have a question or a comment for either of our speakers, please type it in at any time to the Q&A column, and I will read the questions after the end of their formal remarks. If you're having an issue with the audio-visual quality or a problem, something like that, that's where you want to use the chat column. Paul Wallace will address those questions. We do have closed captioning turned on today. If you prefer to see this broadcast without subtitles, you can click on the CC button in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and turn off the subtitles. The program runs for an hour, including both the formal remarks from the two speakers and the time for questions. We are recording this event for those who are not able to be present for this seminar, and the recording will be made available on our website within a few days. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to turn things over to our first speaker, President Neel Kashkari of the Fed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judy. It is great to be with you. Thank you for having us. We really appreciate it. My name is Neel Kashkari, President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. I'm going to start briefly, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and partner, Justice Page. I moved to Minnesota 5.5 years ago when I joined the Minneapolis Fed. And one of my big surprises when I moved to Minnesota was to discover that Minnesota has some of the worst education disparities in the country. What does that mean? That means that low-income children, white children, and children of color, on average, are badly trailing their middle class and more well-to-do peers in Minnesota. When you look around the country, that's not true everywhere. So I asked my researchers, we have some wonderful economists at the Minneapolis Fed, I said, help me understand why these gaps exist, what has been done in Minnesota to try to close the gaps, and what progress have we made, and what can we learn from around the country? And what we realized as we looked at the data and we looked at the record is that there have been many good faith attempts in the last 20 or 30 years in Minnesota to improve education outcomes for low-income children and children of color. But if we're being honest with each other, we have to admit that we have made literally zero progress. If anything, by some measures, we've gone backwards, despite all of that work. Now, you look around the country, there are states that have made real progress in only 15 or 20 years. You know, sometimes as we're doing this work, we'll meet people and they'll say, oh, you've got it all wrong. You have to first solve poverty. Well, that's completely backwards, because the most powerful tool any of us has to solve poverty is actually education. So to say we have to first solve poverty in order to fix education, it's just an excuse. Honestly, it's just an excuse. And you know, why does the Federal Reserve care? Why are we at this table? We care because the United States Congress has charged the Federal Reserve. One of our goals is to achieve maximum employment, as many Americans as possible gainfully employed and contributing to our economy. And the single most important determinant of your success or my success in the job market is the education that we have. So we don't set education policy at the Federal Reserve, but we care a lot about it because it really determines how vibrant and competitive our economy is going to be. So when we analyze why has Minnesota made no progress and other states have made real progress, it dawned on me that Minnesota seems to have a political problem. You know, we're a politically divided state. Both parties care about education, but they don't agree on the solutions. So what do? They nibble around the edges. That's all they can agree on, instead of fundamentally updating and transforming the education system itself. Whereas some other states have had the political will to make big changes in their education system and put children first. So more than 2 years ago, I reached out to Justice Page. We didn't know each other. I reached out to him because I knew he had spent 22 years on Minnesota's Supreme Court, and I knew that he had a passion for education. I'd heard of the Page Education Foundation that he and his wife founded more than 30 years ago. And I knew he cared about education equity. And so I asked him, I said, Justice Page, I'm not a lawyer, but is there a way we could use the law to put children first and to break through these political barriers that are preventing us from making real reform? So we started looking at it. We started by looking at the foundation of our state, the state constitution. You know, all 50 states in America have a state constitution. They're all somewhat different. Turns out all 50 state constitutions say something about education. Minnesota's education provision in our state constitution, remarkably, was written in 1857, and remarkably has not changed since 1857, while many other states have updated their state constitutions for education over time. Minnesota is a laggard. We have not. And it turns out Minnesota's education provision essentially says that children in Minnesota have the right to access an adequate education system. What does that mean, an adequate education system? It is a system that is on average adequate. It is terrific for some. It is lousy for others. And if your child or your grandchild has access to that system, whether they're at the top of the system or the bottom, it doesn't matter. Their rights have been fulfilled. So when we studied that, it all of a sudden dawned on us, Minnesota's education system today is performing exactly as the Constitution has required it to perform, as defined in 1857. And obviously, just a quick history reminder, in 1857, slavery was still legal in much of America. So we said, if we really want to drive systematic change, we need to start with the foundation of the system, which is the state constitution. And so we have a proposal that Justice Page will take you through in a moment, but in 30 seconds, it updates the state constitution to create a civil right for every child to receive a quality public education, and then makes delivering on that right the state's #1 priority. We believe this can lead to systematic change that can finally transform our education system and put children first. And Justice Page will walk you through, again, he is the legal expert. He will walk you through how he sees this, and we very much look forward to taking your questions. Thank you. Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Neel. Let me just begin, if I could see the slide, please. If you take a look on the right, the current constitutional language, which Neel noted, is from 1857 and provides a right to an adequate education system. You will see that it makes reference to the legislature's responsibility to establish a general and uniform system of public schools, and the legislature's obligation to provide by taxation or otherwise the funding of a thorough and efficient system of public schools. That language has systematically and systemically had just a devastating impact on children of color, indigenous children, and poor white children. It is, as I say, systematically and systemically left them behind. You'll note that that language doesn't refer at all to children, and they're the ones, presumably, who are intended to benefit from our system of education. And so looking at that language and thinking about how we would update it, we thought that if we shift the focus to include children, making education a civil right, that we could create a catalyst for real change. Now, you might note that the language on its face is race neutral, but yet it has these terrible, terrible impacts, particularly on young people of color. And so we've come up with the language on the left, which begins all children. And when we say all children, we mean all children, whether that be Black children or brown children, indigenous children, whether it be disabled children and able-bodied children, wealthy children or poor children, rural children or urban children. All children in Minnesota would have a fundamental right to a quality public education. Note that the language, current language on the right, is provides for an adequate education system, doesn't require an adequate education, just an adequate education system. Our proposed amendment would require a quality public education. People often ask us, how do you define quality? Well, it's defined in the language itself. All children have a fundamental right to a quality public education that fully prepares them with the skills necessary for participation in our economy, our democracy, and our society. Thus, quality would be defined. We will know quality when we see it, when children are fully prepared with the skills necessary for participation in our economy, our democracy, and our society. We go on to provide as measured against uniform achievement standards. What's that language? Uniform achievement standards set forth by the state. What's the purpose of that language? The purpose of that language is to ensure that children are performing, but also that the system is performing. We have to have some viable way to measure performance, because otherwise we could just dumb down the system, provide that everybody graduate, make it so that everybody graduates. And while we would have ended some of the disparities that we see, we would have children who were unprepared for careers, unprepared for college, and in effect, not accomplishing much of anything. Important to what our proposed language would require is it would make education and ensuring quality public schools and a quality public education a paramount duty of the state. And I'll just read it to you. It is a paramount duty of the state to ensure quality public schools that fulfill this fundamental right. Now, by paramount duty, that would mean that the state would have no higher obligation, no higher responsibility than to ensure quality public schools that fulfill a child's right to a quality public education. There is nothing else in the Minnesota Constitution that is set forth as a paramount duty. There may be other things that the state does that rise to the same level, but education would be at the top of the state's obligations. And I would just note that when we talk about the state, each branch of the state government would have an obligation to ensure quality public schools. That is to say, the legislature would have its role in setting out funding and setting policy. The the executive branch would have its responsibility in carrying out those policies and implementing them, and the judicial branch would have a role, so that when the executive and or the legislative branches fail to fulfill a child's fundamental right, that child would have a place to go to have his or her rights vindicated, his or her rights fulfilled. As I said before, we think this language could be a catalyst for real change. And the fact is that real change is necessary. We cannot continue to do what we've been doing for the last, I don't know how many decades, and getting the same result. We see the disparities in educational opportunity and performance, and we say it's terrible, it's awful, we need to do something about it. But the fact is that basically we keep working around the edges and not really getting at the heart of the problem. And we think that by amending our Constitution, making education the highest priority, making it a civil right, that we can bring about real change. Did I miss anything, Neel?
You know, no, I'll just say two quick things and we'll open it up to Q&A, and there's a lot more content that we can cover in the Q&A. You know, people ask, well, okay, you change words on a page, so what? It's that last thing that Alan said that I just want to reiterate, which is, why is this a catalyst for change? You know, we've met with many legislative leaders on both parties who say, hey, we don't want the courts getting involved designing the education system of the future. And just what Alan said, only if the legislature and the governor and the executive branch fail to act would a family have any reason to go to court, and would a court then have reason to step in. So that's why we think this can be a very powerful catalyst. You know, one legislative leader said to us, well, if that's the case, then we can just make sweeping changes right now. We don't need this amendment. We said, that's wonderful. How come you haven't done it? You've had decades. Why haven't you done it? And this, just as Alan said, we think is a catalyst. Now, last thing, then we're going to turn it back over and answer questions. What's so exciting about this is it's completely nonpartisan. We have united Democrats of color from the Twin Cities with conservative Republicans from Greater Minnesota, because they know that low-income white kids in Greater Minnesota are also badly falling behind through our current education system. We've united the CEOs of the biggest businesses in Minnesota and Attorney General Ellison, who's a staunch supporter of this. And so this is exciting to us because it can lead to systematic change, and it's completely nonpartisan. So it's bringing the different parties together, which is what has been missing. You know, some people have said to us on this journey we've been on, we don't like your plan. We say, great, what's your plan? And crickets. Nobody has offered us an alternative that can lead to systematic transformational change and that can generate bipartisan support. A plan that cannot generate bipartisan support is not a plan, it's just a soundbite. And so we've said to anybody who will listen, we are open to other ideas, we're open to making this language better, but it needs to lead to transformational change of our education system, and it needs to preserve bipartisan support. And we're excited that this does both of those things. So with that, thank you. We'd love to take questions and hear your comments.
Okay, and so now I will say to the audience, now it is your turn to ask questions. Remember, type them in the Q&A column, and I will read them for our speakers. And we do have a couple of questions already, but we have room for plenty more, so please type your questions in now. So our first question, and I think I'll just put the question out there and let the two of you determine which of you should take the question. The questioner says, I agree that we need to change, but isn't the problem lack of political will? How does this amendment address this issue, lack of political will?
Well, I would just say the short answer is that the courts will give the legislature and the executive the political will. It will require that children's rights be fulfilled. That's something that we don't have today. Our language, our proposal provides both a carrot and the stick. The carrot being in the first instance, the legislature and the executive branch will have the ability to work with parents, teachers, and educators to create a system of education for the future. We think that's what will happen. That's what's happened in other places when they've amended their constitutions. Indeed, litigation hasn't increased, but in the event that they don't, that we continue to, for lack of a better way to describe it, drag our feet. The courts will provide the stick, which will create real action.
In your opening remarks, Mr. Kashkari, you alluded to research that you had done in other states where these kind of barriers have been obliterated by, presumably by perhaps a new legislative amendment to other states' constitutions or other measures. Could you give a couple of examples? We seem to be so short of examples of genuine solutions to this problem.
Yeah, thank you, Judy. The best example we have, there are a few, but the best one we have is the state of Florida, where in the late 1990s, Florida and Minnesota were roughly neck and neck in terms of education disparities, near the bottom of the pack in the 30s by this one measure. The people of Florida amended their constitution. They said, we want quality education for all of our children in Florida. The governor and the legislature then came together and passed sweeping reforms. They did a lot of things. They shrunk class sizes. They invested more in teacher preparation. There were more accountability measures. They gave families more options. In 15 or 16 years, Minnesota has gone sideways. Actually, we went down one notch in ranking. And Florida, by disparities, climbed up near the top to 6th spot from in the 30s. In 15 or 16 years, remarkable progress. And let me just say, Florida still has poverty. Florida still has families that are not the perfect two-parent household, that has challenges. And yet they have made real progress. And so we're not saying we should take Florida's blueprint and just do what Florida did. But if Florida can do it, really, Minnesota families are not up to the task. Minnesota's school system is not up to the task if we have the political will to put children first. And the one other example I'll just give you, there are others. There was a court case in Washington State. So when Alan and I came up with this language, we looked at all the different state constitutions to get ideas from what people have done. And we believe we've taken the best of all the different options to create the strongest provision here in Minnesota. The state of Washington also uses the expression all children. And it's remarkable, the courts in Washington had a ruling about education funding where they said all children means all children, does not mean most children, does not mean the majority of children, does not mean some children. It means all children. And it was a very powerful ruling that we said, wow, you know what? We want all children in Minnesota to matter too.
All right, our next question asks, how have educators of excellence contributed to your conversations?
Is that a specific group or is that we met with lots and lots of education groups? And
I think it's the latter. The phrase is not capitalized. I am not familiar with a group called Educators of Excellence specifically. If I am wrong, I hope the questioner will correct me. Oh, excuse me. I'm seeing there is a group called Educators for Excellence. But more broadly, there's another question. Does Education Minnesota, the teachers union, support your proposal? Perhaps you could speak not to particular educational groups, but to professional educators and what their role has been in this and what some of their reactions are.
Well, I'll just begin. We've spent time with school board members. We've spent time with superintendents. We've spent time with teachers. We've spent time with the leadership of Education Minnesota. Teachers, by and large, I can't say are categorically supportive, but they are excited about the possibility of something that creates real change. everybody's got questions about the details, and those details are something that if we get it on the ballot, that's when the real work will begin to create the educational system of the future. But I think the teachers that I've talked to and spent time with are excited about the prospects. We've had good conversations with school administrators, with say superintendents and school board members. We have had nothing but opposition from Education Minnesota. We met with them early on in this process and sat down and said, this is what we're proposing. We would love your input. If you think there are ways we could make this language better, stronger, we are open to that. We're not open to making it weaker, but we are open to making it stronger. They said they would get back to us, and they got back to us with, we're going to fight you tooth and nail, and they've been doing that from day one. They have been fighting for the status quo.
Okay. What specific changes are you expecting to happen with the passage of this amendment?
Well, I have a view that education works best when we educate children one school at a time, one classroom at a time, one child at a time. And I think this amendment gives us the opportunity to focus on individual children and their education, as opposed to focusing on the system. And I think that is where the real power comes in this, because it would require that each child receive what they need to put them in the position to achieve and reach their highest potential. And that's my sense of where things really will change.
And the only thing I would add to that, Judy, is that if you look at the language that we proposed, it's not prescriptive. It doesn't say this should be the class size, or this should be the curriculum, or this should be the method of instruction. We think that is best left to the parents and the teachers to decide for themselves. And if you look around the state, I think we would both guess that as this plays out, as this goes forward, different regions will develop different education systems that are customized for the families in their community, for the economies in their community, to meet their needs, because they're going to be different. And we think that's great. I mean, when I think back to the current language of what do I think of as general and uniform and adequate, that's what the current language is. General and uniform and adequate. You know what I think of general and uniform and adequate? McDonald's. You go to any McDonald's in America, and a Big Mac is a Big Mac is a Big Mac. I've got two very young children. I certainly aspire to better. Now, don't get me wrong. We love McDonald's French fries in my house. So, I'll confess that. But I certainly aspire to a better education for my children than general and uniform and adequate. And it shouldn't just be children of privilege that get that.
All right, I'm going to take this next question a little bit out of order because I believe it relates to what we've been talking about. This person says, as a retired educator, I worry that the measure of quality will devolve to standardized test results. A healthy multidimensional measure of educational success is crucial. But my question would be, how do you standardize such a multidimensional measure? Could you comment on that as the role of standardized test results?
I will just point out to you that is the system we have today. Mm-hmm. And obviously it isn't contributing to educational excellence. And so almost by definition, to fulfill the obligation for creating a quality public education, that can't be the measure. What will happen, we think, is that, ideally, as we work towards trying to get this proposed amendment on the ballot, there would be those sitting and sort of thinking about and designing the educational system of the future and designing the measurement tools of the future. Unfortunately, that's not happening as we sit here. And so, but that will need to take place, and it will have to be a system that, as I noted, measures not only where children are, which is what standardized tests do. They take a snapshot of a given moment, but will also inform us as to how we go about helping those children grow and develop. It will also need to be a system that measures the system, a tool that measures the education system itself. How is it performing? How is it doing its job? We don't measure that now. And we think there's a tremendous need. And I would just note that, and I'm no expert by any stretch of the imagination, but in corporate America, they measure performance every day. They measure, how things are going, how you can be better, what's wrong, what's right. And they don't use standardized tests.
All right. Let's turn perhaps to the legislative role here. Can you name some legislators on both sides that are on board in support of this amendment? Has there been a bill introduced or legislative authors identified?
Yeah, so just briefly, the process to amend Minnesota's constitution is that both bodies of the state legislature, the House and Senate, have to pass a bill, and then it goes to the voters in the next general election ballot. And you need a simple majority in both houses, and then you need a majority in that general election. So both bills have been introduced in the House and Senate in the spring. They're a little bit different than each other. That's the normal legislative process. And then they carry over, and they are now live, so to speak, in this next upcoming session in January. And when it passes through the legislature this spring, it'll then appear on the November ballot, November 2022, for the people of Minnesota.
Okay.
So it has been introduced in both bodies with bipartisan authors. In the House, Representative Hadan Hassan, Representative Ron Krisha, so Democrat, Republican, Representative Erickson, Representative Jay Jong, again, Republican, Democrat, are some of the lead authors in the House. I think there's a lot of lead authors in the House. And in the Senate, Senator Michelle Benson, and Beth, remind me of who the Democratic sponsor is in the Senate.
Yeah, just 1 second, Neel.
Thank you.
I'm going to just insert here, Beth, perhaps you could put some of these names in the chat column. We will have questions, people wanting to get in touch, perhaps, and that would be very helpful if you could put it in the chat column for everyone to see.
Yeah, I sure can, Judy.
Thank you.
And there are many in the House. There's a smaller list in the Senate, but we're working hard to introduce the concept to more senators. And again, though, the most important thing is it's bipartisan. If it's not bipartisan, it's not going anywhere in Minnesota. And that's what we just think is so important.
I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that in the House, we have bipartisan support. We do not have the support of one white member of the DFL. Not one.
No support from any white members of the DFL. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
In the House.
In the House.
Yeah.
We do in the Senate, but not in the House.
I'd like to acknowledge the disembodied voice you're hearing. This is Beth Cummers of the Fed. So she is also very helpful behind the scenes here. But I'm going to charge right forward. Next question is about taxes. Won't this cost money? What about taxes to implement this?
Well, it might. I mean, it'll depend. The education research is clear that if you just pour more money in the same education system without making other changes, you don't get any better outcomes. So are some schools in Minnesota underfunded? Almost unquestionably. But it can't just be more money. It also has to be with empowering parents and teachers to make the kind of changes that they need to make. And how is this generating bipartisan support? Traditionally, most Republican leaders will say, we don't want to raise taxes. We don't want to spend more money. A lot of the leaders we met with have said, we're fine. We're willing to spend more money in education, but we just want better outcomes. We are not willing to spend more money and get the same outcomes. And so will this lead to more funding for schools? If I were to guess, I'd say yes. Certainly not less, because quality education costs more than an adequate education. But it's not just about the money. The money is important, but it's not everything.
Okay, I guess we'll move on. You have to some degree addressed this next question, but I will ask it as well, just to see if there's anything you want to add. What is the timeline for presenting this amendment change to the legislature? The person says, as an Isaiah activist, I am trying to figure out how we get more people involved to push this forward.
Well, the timeline is such that we've been working on it now for coming up on our third year. And to get it on the November 2022 ballot, we have to get the legislature to pass it this upcoming session. That is to say, we need to get both houses to by majority vote to put it on the ballot.
And do you have specific suggestions for how we could, how you could get more people involved to forward this issue?
Well, let your legislators hear your voices. That's number one. It's surprising how powerful constituents can be when they contact their legislators. And so that's number one. Neel, do you have?
The other thing is, Alan and I are talking to anybody who will listen about the idea, but there's a separate independent bipartisan campaign that has formed called Our Children Minnesota, that is formally advocating. So they're building networks of community groups across the state. They are formally engaging with legislators. They're raising money. I mean, they're running a professional campaign. You could get engaged with them. Our Children Minnesota, and maybe Beth can put their website on the chat. If anybody wanted to get involved, I'm sure they would love to send you all their information and get you engaged in their work.
I have put their name in the chat line. Oh, and I see Beth has put in their website.
Thank you.
Okay, we've had a number of questions. People would like to know how they can get involved with the promotion of the passage of the amendment. Let's see, here is a question. Why is Education Minnesota against this amendment? Well, we probably should give them a voice as well, but would you care to, characterize their opposition?
Well, they make a number of arguments, and I think I can accurately articulate some of them. I'm not sure that I understand them. One is that our proposed amendment is really just a vehicle to help or to lead to privatization of public education. That's one of their arguments. That argument is belied by the language that we use. It is a paramount duty of the state to ensure quality public schools. You cannot, well, I suppose you could try. You could, it makes it a real challenge to privatize public education when public education has to be your highest priority. And I would note that the current constitutional language, if the legislature were to pass a law and the governor were to sign it, they could, under the current language, go down the privatization road today. There is nothing that prevents that. There's nothing in the current language that prevents it. Nothing which discourages it. In our language, while it's still possible to do, it becomes a real challenge given the high priority that public education is. I would also note that our language is focused solely on public education. It's not focused on homeschooling. It's not focused on private schools. It's focused on public education. Another argument is that only wealthy families will have the ability, if it comes to litigation, to pursue litigation, and litigation takes too long. Well, I dare say that 40 years of the same thing over and over again, which has led us to where we are today, takes too long. Having the courts involved can be a real catalyst for change. In addition, historically, when it has come to the little litigation that there's been with respect to education in Minnesota, it hasn't been wealthy families who have pursued it. It has been poor families. Beyond that, one of their arguments is that the argument being that our language about the uniform achievement standards as set forth by the state, they make the argument that that's really just a vehicle to constitutionalize standardized testing. As I noted before, that argument just doesn't hold water. Trying to think if there's anything else. There are some other.
Yeah. No, I think you captured it.
There are some other arguments, but they don't hold any more water than those do.
Right.
Their arguments really are just an argument for maintaining the status quo.
You know,
Okay,
Judy, can I add one
Please.
thing? You know,
Sure.
I moved to Minnesota 5.5 years ago. Nowhere I have lived where there's as much talk about equity as there is in Minnesota. And is there a big disconnect in the talk and the reality? You know, I read this article a few weeks ago, maybe a week or two ago, a devastating article about an African-American man who was a tech entrepreneur living in St. Paul. And his startup is having a lot of success, which is wonderful. And he'd had so many bad experiences as an African-American man in Minnesota that he finally said enough is enough. And you know where he moved? He moved to Texas. Just let that sink in for a second. He moved to Texas because he said Texas is going to be more welcoming than Minnesota is. So for all of Minnesota's wonderful talk about equity, the journey that Al and I have been on now for a couple of years, what we are doing is we're confronting all of the barriers to real change. And people look you in the eye and they say, we care about children too. We care about children of color. We care about low-income white children. And then they come up with 20 nonsensical excuses to defend the status quo while pretending that they're trying to actually do something for children. The reason why this amendment has united people across the aisle is people across the aisle are saying, you know what, enough is enough. We're going to literally put children first, and we're going to enshrine it in the Constitution. So Education Minnesota, the teachers union, is opposed to the children of Minnesota having a civil right to a quality public education, and then making delivering that public education the state's #1 priority. I can't explain that.
If I understood the implication of an earlier statement of yours, Justice Page, this effort seems to be a union of outstate Republican legislatures and non-white DFL legislatures. That seems to be
in the House.
In the House, yes, but in any forum, that seems to be a very unusual coalition. And I'd like to hear more about that. What are some of the ramifications? What are some of the implications of that?
Well, I think I think what causes that those two groups to come together is that children of color are being left behind. Rural white children, poor white children are being left behind. And those two groups have an interest in ensuring that the children that they represent are no longer left behind. You know, when you think about it, education at some level is really about justice. Whether it's economic justice, whether it's racial justice, social justice, health justice, housing justice, that's what education is about. And every child that's being left behind is a child who will grow up to become a less than, I've lost my word here.
They're diminished.
A diminished employee, a diminished taxpayer, a diminished contributor to our community, and maybe a burden on our community. And why do we insist on continuing to allow that to happen? If we give every child a civil right to a quality public education, it will give children the opportunity to achieve their highest potential, whatever that is. You know, not every child is going to be an economist. Not every child is going to be a doctor, but every child should have the opportunity to achieve whatever their fullest potential is. And by making education a civil right, we can do that. We can create that opportunity. And by creating opportunity, we create hope. We give children a reason to want to build the society that they live in, and a reason not to want to tear it down.
I see a number of questions here that really bring it all back to the money. Can we afford to educate every child to their specific needs? Another questioner says, follow the money in terms of opposition to your proposal. Money always comes into it. Would you want to address those concerns?
All I can say is, can we afford not to?
And I would just,
those are the choices.
Mhm.
and how are other states doing it? I mean, I'm just amazed that Minnesotans are satisfied being so mediocre. We're not comparing ourselves to Finland here. We're comparing ourselves to Florida.
And I would just note, we've seen some, the Federal Reserve has a new tool on their website that you can take a look at, educational performance by legislative district and some other measures. That tool tells us that for, is it 2020, Neel? The last year they could measure that, I believe it's either 42 or 44% of Minnesota's children are reading at grade level. 44%. Think about that. Can we afford to continue that? What is the future going to look like, not only for those children, but for all of us?
My children are now adults. They're in their late 20s and 30s. But when they were in school, Minnesota performance standards were pretty high. I remember when my children were taking the ACT, SAT tests, that Minnesota had some of the highest, average scores in the nation. has there been a decline in the performance of the Minnesota schools overall, or is part of the gap between high performing and low performing students in Minnesota partly a function of the fact that the top students do so well in this state?
I think the top students do well. I don't think they do as well as most Minnesotans think they do. Minnesotans tend to view itself through a rose-colored glasses, as they say. But just as Alan said, I mean, the middle of that distribution is nothing to be proud of, let alone the low end of that distribution. And so when you look at, again, go back to Florida, I don't have the data in front of me, but it wasn't simply that they lifted the bottom up. They lifted everybody up, and they lifted the bottom up.
And I would note that this proposal does just that. It lifts everybody up. It will close the gaps, but it will lift everybody up.
All right. Next question here. Will the amendment require the state to equalize spending across districts? The district I worked in, this person says, was relatively wealthy, but there was a spending and policy disparity even among our own schools.
It's not prescriptive. I mean, it will depend on what individual children need and what that individual school needs. And so, Minnesota has actually, if you look at the data across the country, Minnesota has actually done quite a good job in equalizing funding around the state. It's not perfect, but it's gone further than most states. And yet you see the outcomes that we're getting for that. It's more evident that it's not simply about money. And so where money is a constraint, then that obviously needs to be part of the solution. But in a lot of cases, you ask teachers, they're working passionately on behalf of kids, but in many cases their hands are tied. And they're saying, boy, we wish we had the freedom to teach in a way that we know our kids need. And so this is meant to give them that freedom.
What position, what is the implications for the charter school movement and for independent private schools? Do they figure into the equation in this proposal?
Well, in Minnesota, charter schools are public schools. So children going to charter schools would have the same right because they're public schools. This amendment is not intended to, and I don't believe does have any impact on private schools.
Okay. All right. Well, we are running low on time here. This has been most interesting. We still do have a number of questions in the column, and I'll try to ask a couple more. But let's see. This person says the system, as a progressive teacher, I agree with your ideas and philosophy, but the system is the rub. The system will fight tooth and nail to maintain the status quo. Do you agree?
God bless whoever just said that, because that's what we are fighting. That's what we are encountering every day. Teachers who are doing the work have devoted their lives to helping kids, and nonprofits working with kids have devoted their lives, and yet they're fighting against the system. We're saying, let's change the system so the system is supporting them instead of fighting them. But she or he, whoever said that, is exactly right, that the system is the inertia of the system is all fighting to protect itself, and that's what we are encountering.
Okay. And another comment, in my district, oh, no, here we go. Here's a new question. How does our large immigrant population play into this ranking results?
I mean, their kids are in the data too. And if you look at the data of where Minnesota's population is, where our growth is going to come from, most of the growth over the next 20 or 30 years is being driven by communities of color. And so, you ask yourself, why are the CEOs of the biggest businesses in Minnesota passionately supporting this work? Because those are their future employees. And they say, if our business wants to continue to grow, we can grow in Minnesota, which is our preference, or we can grow outside of Minnesota, or we can grow around the world. If Minnesota is not going to develop the workers, then we're going to have to go somewhere else. And so, yeah, you bet. The immigrant kids are part of the equation. Kids of color, low-income white kids, they all matter. And so they are all going to be treated equally under the law with the Page Amendment.
Okay, and I think we have time for just one more question, comment, and perhaps if you gentlemen have final statements you'd like to make. This person says, I taught in a school that is one of the most sought after in the state. Our teachers were afraid to speak up about progressive ideas. Did you want to comment on that, or did you want to just add anything to in the last few minutes to our discussion?
I would only say that our proposed amendment empowers not only children and families, but it empowers teachers.
I'll give you a quick analogy. Imagine if you were a doctor or nurse in a hospital working to help your patient every day. And now imagine that there was a civil right to quality healthcare. As a doctor or nurse, wouldn't that be very powerful to help you help your patients? It seems, I'm not a doctor, but that seems pretty clear to me that it would give me more voice, not less voice.
Okay, well, we're just about out of time here, but do either of you have any last remarks? Here's the chance to.
Well, I would just say thank you, and we need your help. We need your support. And what this is really about is changing the future, making it better, making it brighter for all of us. And this is an opportunity that we can't let slip away.
I couldn't have said any better. Thank you.
Okay, and I want to thank both of our speakers, Justice Alan Page, Neel Kashkari, President of the Fed. I also want to thank the very able behind the scenes people. That would be Paul Wallace, Chris Long, and Beth Cummers. Thank you so much. And certainly I want to thank our audience for your excellent questions that help us illuminate this issue. So I appreciate everyone. Thank you so much. And I'm going to say goodbye for today. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.